Hi everyone, so we are here today answering questions. I'm having you guys send in questions in advance so I can categorize them and answer them for you. So if you have questions, make sure you're sending them in. I'm finding this is an easier way to try to get to all of your questions that I want to answer, but am now getting so many I can't answer them all on Facebook. By the way, if I look like a lizard today, I apologize. I am doing some exfoliating treatment and I look like a lizard. So there you go. That is why. No matter what I seem to do, people will write in and ask me what's going on. So that's what's going on. I look like a lizard. So let's start off by giving you one resource. It took me a while to actually gather all of this information. I did a video with our doctor at our clinic, Dr. Farrell. She's one of our doctors who treats a lot of the eating disorders, because she treats addictions. So food addiction is one of those. And the video kind of blew up my page. There was a lot of activity, a lot of questions, a lot of concerns. And so a lot of questions came in. Took me a while to get through them all, to gather all that information for you. I say it all the time, I'm not going to overstep my boundaries, but I will gather that information from our professionals for you. And one of the resources I want to give you is the National Eating Disorders Association, their website. So some of these questions you can get answered there, but of course I also am going to give you feedback from our professionals at Amen Clinics. So one thing I don't want to leave out while talking about this is the brain. Okay, what's going on in the brain while all of this is happening? For so long, the psychology has been sort of thought about, and rightfully so, but we always want to be thinking about what's going on in the brain. Why do some people have, compulsive eating disorders and some people have impulsive eating disorders, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So, but one of the first questions that came in is, what are eating disorders? It's basically any disturbance of an eating behavior, of normal eating behaviors, but it can affect anyone at any age, gender, race, any socioeconomic group. It really doesn't discriminate. So what's really interesting is a lot of people think of this as a female disorder. It's not. It affects a lot of men as well. So 20 million women and 10 million men in America will have an eating disorder at some point in their lives. One of the questions was, does this only affect women? How many men are actually affected? And the one of the resources said that it was what I just said, 20 million women and 10 million men will be affected at some time. Another source said that it was about 3-to-1 was the ratio. So, so you can see it's significant for men as well. Can you fully recover from an eating disorder? Most of the experts seem to say that you can recover, but they don't use the word cure. And I guess one of the reasons is probably like any addiction, they always want you to be vigilant. So they want to make sure that you are paying attention to the signs, because a lot of people will hold on to the disordered thought process, if you will. They can control the behavior, but they may, if they're not careful, where they get triggered, end up with that thought process again. So just something to pay attention to. Is restricting food a sign of an eating disorder? So the question is, why are you restricting food? How much are you restricting? And there's a gray area there, I would say. So what does it mean? Why are you restricting food? I mean, it could be anything from a 12-hour fast. That's restricting food. Are you restricting foods that you are allergic to? Are you restricting foods that you know are not healthy for you? Or are you restricting them because you have obsessive thoughts about them? I don't know what the answer is there. There's a lot of gray areas there. One of the issues with eating disorders is they say that when people cut out whole groups of food, that could be considered an eating disorder. And that's one place that my husband and I would probably disagree, because there are foods that are not good for you, period. I wouldn't even call them foods. So if you are eating foods that are not good for you, like processed foods that are loaded with garbage, and you decide to cut that out, I'm going to disagree that that's an eating disorder. But if you're cutting out foods that are generally thought to provide nutrition for your body, that is a wholesome food, that's not laden with chemicals, that's not processed, then that's different. Okay, I hope that we can distinguish those differences. Also, foods that you're allergic to. that would be okay to cut out. So we want to differentiate what's good for you and what's bad for you, because there are foods that are bad for you, and that's where we would disagree with that black and white line. How do I support someone who's experiencing an eating disorder? That was one of the questions. Okay, this one's hard, because the person that you want to support has to want help. If you're wanting to help them, support them and help them, or get them help, are two different things. But they've got to want the help if you're going to try to get them help. And one thing that we always talk about are the words firm and kind, but you also want to be honest, not mean, but honest. They need to know how you feel about what is happening to them or how it's affecting your family, but without shaming them. I hope that makes sense. Because most eating disorders aren't really about food, right? So you want to be careful not to make it worse. And know your limits, because they're in control of their disease. So you have to know your limits and avoid conflicts with them. Because there is, for a lot of people, I'm not going to say all people, but for some people, there is an aspect of control associated with their disorder. So you have to be careful to avoid the conflict or the power struggle. And don't ignore it either. So ignoring the eating disorder is not going to be helpful. You want to be honest and pay attention to it, and be loving, caring, kind, and just aware of it. But if you try to if you try to force them to eat, that's where it can get really ugly, because that's not going to work, and sometimes it's about control. So next one. I'm concerned about someone who may have an eating disorder. What should I do? So the information that I gave you, National Eating Disorders Association, you can get some information there. You can gather information from an expert, like we've got experts at our clinics. There's a lot of people who, you can find someone who works with eating disorders, and you can go see that person yourself to figure out what you should be doing as the person who cares. But again, go back to that list I just mentioned, and do what we just talked about, right? You don't want to get into that power struggle. And then let's see, how do I know if I have an eating disorder? So again, there's some gray areas, right? People hear this, they hear things like, well, if you cut out an entire type of food, any type of food, but you refuse to eat it, then that's considered an eating disorder. Well, what about vegans? Okay. I wouldn't say that that's an eating disorder. Sorry about that. You may disagree with their choice, but it's not necessarily an eating disorder, right? That's just a choice that people are making. So, but because you're vegan doesn't mean that you have an eating disorder. So that's where it gets to be gray. Because there's a lot of times there are personal values attached to food. So that's why, so how do you know if you have an eating disorder? Let's go over what they actually say at the National Eating Disorders Association. So constant or repetitive dieting, regular binge eating or hoarding food, evidence of vomiting or laxative abuse. I'm not talking about like when you're sick or when you are constipated on a rare occasion, talking about like actually using it as weight control. Excessive or compulsive exercise patterns. I was actually guilty of that. I didn't realize that was actually even considered a form of like purging, but it is. When I was younger, I used to like be obsessed with sweating and going to the gym, even if I was sick, even if I was injured. That's one of the criteria. Are you going when you're sick and injured? Making a list of good and bad foods, that's the gray area, because there are foods that are bad. There's foods I wouldn't even consider food. So if they're not serving your health, I would consider it bad. But that's where you need to like pay attention. Are you doing the other things in context? How many things are you doing on this list? Frequent avoidance of eating meals by giving excuses. So this is one thing. People will actually prepare foods. They'll go to a family meal. They'll go out with friends. They'll say, well, I already ate. But of course they didn't already eat. So they make excuses why they can't eat. But they constantly do that. That could be a sign. Or making excuses like they can't eat because they feel sick. If you notice that could be evidence. people with eating disorders tend to become socially withdrawn. If it's anorexia, or even people who are gaining weight, you'll notice that they'll start to wear baggier clothes. So sometimes their clothes change. Deceptive behavior around food. They'll lie. People start lying and they hoard food. So it's very interesting. And people will eat very slowly. I've seen people do this. They'll push food around on their plate, make you think they're eating, and they eat super slow. They're actually, the entire meal, they've only eaten a couple of bites. But you'll see them push food around on the plate to make you think they're eating. Denial of hunger, sudden rapid weight loss. A lot of these are very, I'm getting a visitor. A lot of these are sort of what you would think of, but some of them you may not have heard of. Fatigue, they get very, very tired. Other things, that's my alarm. We have a little place we stay at up in LA. Hi, honey. Oh, by the way, we're opening a new clinic up here in Encino, so I'm up here sort of getting this place ready. Hi, babe. Got a visitor with his earbuds on. You could actually join me if you want. We'll get the brain part from the expert. So you might notice people with bulimia get sores on their knuckles. They will get swollen jaw, like swollen cheeks and jaws. Their teeth might start to yellow or erode. Always dissatisfied with their body. There's a whole list. I'm not going to go through the entire list. One of the questions was, my child is a picky eater. Does this mean that he or she has an eating disorder? Not necessarily. And this is really interesting. There's a woman, a PhD, named Andrea Vazana, and she's at New York University. I thought this was really interesting. She conducted a large study, actually. And I like this term, selective eater. They actually coined this term, selective eater, and that's different from someone who has an eating disorder, okay? These are kids who eat a limited number of items, and they have a strong negative reaction to unwanted foods. As you're sitting here eating while I'm talking about food.
Eating a tangerine.
So it's often considered to be a feeding disorder, not an eating disorder. The difference is they're not concerned with weight. They're not concerned with body image. They're not concerned with weight. These are just really picky kids, okay? And the issue there is that it can be an issue. There's a problem with their nutritional deficiency. That parents can become worried because they're not getting the proper fiber and vitamin-rich foods. And so you really do want to give these kids a supplement. You want to make sure they're getting their vitamins until you can start to introduce and somehow get them to eat other foods. But that's a whole separate issue. That's not necessarily an eating disorder. I'm not saying your kid doesn't have one. I'm saying that if they're not worried about calories and they're not worried about body image, it might not be an eating disorder, okay? My child seems to be preoccupied with dieting. Do they have an eating disorder? Maybe. They might. I would definitely, it's worth talking to an expert. Because when kids start dieting when they're young, and there's a lot of pressure on these kids. I see my daughter starting in 7th grade. I started to see the girls not only taking all these, special herbal remedies for weight, but they were also taking dieters tea, which they market as detox tea. It's laxative tea. And so that was, all of a sudden I started to see this with her friends, and I'm like, okay, we need to have a talk. It's really important to be open, honest, and don't shame these kids. But if your kid is dieting and they're young, yeah, I would talk to somebody. It's worth talking to them. Be candid. And in my daughter's words, this is really interesting. She's the one that told me parents are the reasons that kids don't talk to their parents. Parents are the reasons that they lie. Because they freak out. Because they overreact. Because they don't know how to have an honest, open conversation with their kids without acting like a parent. Meaning, she doesn't mean without parenting, she means without acting like a typical parent that just flips out. So you're gonna have this conversation without flipping out, because they will never tell you otherwise. Someone asked, what's the role that media plays in causing eating disorders? Research is increasingly clear that media does indeed contribute. Now, it's not gonna be the sole source, but it contributes to the pressure that's exerted, and that kids are exposed so much more. They're watching so much more of television or Netflix or whatever it is that media, whatever source it is, they're watching so much of it that what they're doing is they're comparing themselves. They've got this constant comparison that they're making to what they see and what they have. And so that's what's creating the dissatisfaction. And so that's why it's not a good thing. Another question, my daughter has lost a lot of weight and has been diagnosed with anorexia. Why can't she just eat? That is the most common question. Either someone asking, why can't she just eat? Or telling them, you need to just eat. And that is the biggest problem. The biggest problem is, if you don't have anorexia, like, we'll just never understand it. We will never understand why they can't just eat. But they can't. And this is really one of those situations where it really is mind over matter. Their mind is not, they're not going to be able to eat. And it's not just a psychological disorder. There's a lot of research being done now on the hormonal imbalances that are going on along with this. It's not just psychological. There's something going on in the brain, which I'm going to have my husband jump in and talk about. There's something going on with hormones. The hormones of satiety and hunger are possibly affected, at least with some people. So, for example, somatostatin, which is the hormone that makes you feel full, they think that it might be overactive in people with anorexia. So when you are full and you take a bite, somatostatin is released once you've eaten enough and tells you, okay, no more, I'm full. But with people with anorexia, they think maybe they have too much of it. So even one bite makes them feel full. I don't know. It's very complicated. Obviously, they don't know yet either. So it's not clear. But there is a reason they cannot just eat. It's very sad because anorexia isn't it the second leading cause of death in adolescents?
No, suicide.
Suicide is the second. It's the second.
Actually.
It's very high. Anyways, so it's a very high. It's a tragic disease. So, anyways, it's very horrible. My child is very unwell, and the doctor is looking at referring him or her to an eating disorders program. They don't want to attend. No kid really wants to go to one of those. FYI. What should I do? Well, only you can make that decision, but you are the parent, and you are their frontal lobes until they are 25. What would you say about that?
I'm sorry?
What would you say about this? Their child is unwell. Doctor wants them to go to an eating disorders program, and the kid doesn't want to go.
It's a medical decision.
It's a medical decision.
Children don't get to decide on medical decisions.
That's what I would say too. You're the parent. You're their frontal lobes until they're 25.
Yeah, nobody wants to.
And if the doctor is thinking your child is that sick, they don't put kids in inpatient programs unless they're really sick. And it is a deadly disease. So you have to make that decision. I know what decision I would make. Do men and boys get eating disorders too? We already talked about that. Yes, they absolutely get them. And they get body dysmorphia. And when you get body dysmorphia, they don't just have eating disorders. A lot of times that's what causes them to take growth hormone. It's what causes them to exercise excessively. So there's, unfortunately, the figures are elusive on how many men actually get it because the assessment tools have a gender bias. Women, it's considered a women's problem, and men get stigmatized for coming forward. So their numbers are underestimated, by the way. Let's see. So what seems to be the most common with men are laxative abuse. So overeating, binge eating, laxative abuse, and fasting are the most common forms of abuse for men. And the risk of mortality for men is higher than it is for women. That's interesting. So I've just discovered that my son has been making himself sick after meals. He doesn't know that I know. What should I do? So exactly what we talked about before. Don't freak out. Like my daughter would say, don't freak out. Because you don't want to be the reason that he goes into a shell and doesn't talk about it. Be chill, in her words, non-judgmental, curious, and loving, but don't lie. And I would go try to get some professional help. And this one's, I'm a manager of a gym, and we're quite concerned about one of our members. What should we do? I'm not exactly sure what you can do. If she's not in immediate danger, you can't discriminate against her, but what I would be trying to do is form a relationship with her, or maybe one of her family members, because you want to be able to have influence over her, but you can't discriminate against her unless she's doing something that's harmful to herself or others. So you just want to be able to try to talk to her. Unfortunately, a lot of these people isolate. So that's the tricky part. That's why eating disorders are so dangerous. So that's all the questions we had, but I do want to have, can you come over here for a minute? I want to have my husband talk to you guys about the brain issues. You want to share a seat with me?
Hey, everybody.
So let's talk about what's going on in the brain. Why are they different? Why impulsive, compulsive, bulimia versus anorexia versus binge eating?
They're so cute. I always miss you when I'm away. So we have scanned maybe 1,000 kids and adults with eating disorders, and it's clearly not one thing in the brain. Anorexics tend to have brains that work too hard, almost like OCD, and they act like OCD, almost a psychotic form of OCD.
But you mentioned something interesting to me. You said that over time it changes.
Well, as they deprive their brain of the nutrients they need, the brain actually begins to look damaged. It begins to take on a smaller, more toxic.
Well, and that makes sense because they're really malnourished over time. So that makes sense, right? So it's kind of like deteriorating.
People with bulimia have a much higher incidence of ADD. It's sort of, in my work, I've often talked about impulsive, compulsive disorders. So they can't let go of the bad thought, and they don't have control over it. So there's the compulsivity, I'm fat, and they can't then control the impulses about it. So they'll overeat, and then they'll hate themselves, and then they'll purge. I think obesity is also an eating disorder as well, where you just can't stop eating the wrong food, and in a society like ours that offers you the wrong food 9 times out of 10 at least, that it just becomes much harder for people overall.
Well, and this is why I disagree with that, there's no bad foods. That's just wrong. Because some of those foods...
I remember the days...
It's ridiculous.
That note came home from school. There are no bad foods.
Oh my God, it made me mad. But the problem is, especially when you have something like an eating disorder, there are foods that will trigger addiction. So if you have an eating disorder, especially a binge eating disorder, you want to avoid those foods that trigger addictions, like processed foods that are laden with chemicals. They're affecting those hormones of satiety that tell you that you're full, that tell you that you're satisfied. You want to be eating whole foods, nutritious foods, not chemical-laden processed foods. That's absurd. So we want you to be thinking...
And then people's cognition will be better. It's very important you check their omega-3 fatty acid levels,
and vitamin D.
Low levels of omega-3 fatty acids can give you more problems.
And vitamin D too, right?
Vitamin D. I mean, the whole list of, check your important numbers that you and I always talk about. And I think imaging is incredibly important. How do you know what's going on in your brain or your child's brain if you don't actually look at it? And bulimia has 3 times the number of people who have ADD than the general population.
Oh, interesting.
So, because of the impulsivity that goes with it. So how did I do?
Did great. Thank you. Well, such a nice bonus, wasn't it? So I love when I can have him on here just to add that brain piece. It's so fantastic. So anyways, it's just such a tragic thing because there's such a stigma that people don't want to come forward. There's so much shame attached to it. And if you can remove that piece and try to avoid just telling people, just eat, what's wrong with you, even though you might feel that way, you want to be able to try to be more helpful and remove the shame and the stigma so that they can actually get some help. It's complicated. It's not an easy thing. And, society's not making it easier with the foods that we are feeding people. There's chemical imbalances, there's hormone imbalances, there's so much going on. We really want you to get the help you need. I hope these questions were helpful, or the answers to your questions were helpful. And if you have more questions, send them in. Questions about other topics, please keep them coming. And if you want to see the video with Dr. Farrell, you can go to my website, tanaamen.com. You'll find that under my vlogs. There's also some great recipes that are nutritious, delicious, and healthy replacements for those foods that, those foods that are sort of non-foods that taste good but aren't serving your health, but you can still have them. Just make them with wholesome ingredients that are not going to trigger those addictions. Have a great day. Bye-bye.